SR-71, one of the most famous, yet one of the most secretive aircraft, has been for 2 decades the world's fastest and highest flying machine. Produced by the Lockheed Corporation, it's a far cry from the first designs of the company founded by the 2 brothers Malcolm and Allan Loughead in 1913. Raised on a ranch in Alma, both had developed a keen interest in mechanics and worked in the early automobile industry. But flying had caught the imagination of Allan, and in 1910 he became first a self-taught pilot, then an instructor, and finally went into barnstorming, until a disagreement with a telegraph pole ended that career. He walked away from the crash, determined to build a more reliable aircraft. Teaming up with Malcolm and working in their spare time, they produced the Model G. They hoped the designation G would stop it looking like their first attempt. Using the plane to give joy rides around San Francisco Bay at $10 a time, they made 600 trips, and with the profit of $4,000, they moved to Santa Barbara to set up the Lockheed Aircraft Manufacturing Company. The outbreak of war in Europe had a profound effect on aviation, both in Europe and the USA. The planes that had started out in 1914 as flimsy, unreliable, and in many people's opinion, useless objects, became, with the advance in engines and airframes, a highly maneuverable, sophisticated, and potent weapon. At first, the war in Europe seemed remote to most Americans and had little effect on the young aircraft industry. But with the entry of the USA into the conflict, the situation changed dramatically. The demand for combat aircraft was outstripping supply. Allan and Malcolm saw the opportunity and teamed up with a young designer, John K. Northrop, to produce a twin-engine 10-seater flying boat, the F-1. The hoped-for naval orders did not materialize. Instead, they were offered subcontract work to build 2 Curtiss H-2Ls. At the end of the war, they had great hopes of breaking into the civilian market, but this was flooded with cheap ex-war surplus planes, and in 1921, the Lockheed Company went out of business. The partners went their separate ways. Malcolm to develop his highly successful hydraulic brake system with Chrysler's. Allan, for a time, acted as Malcolm's agent, and John Northrop went to work with the Douglas Aircraft Company. But they kept in touch, and when John Northrop in 1926 came up with a design that was to become the Vega, Allan found an investor named Fred Keeler, who owned the Empire China Company. Keeler put up $25,000. By this time, Malcolm Lougheed's brakes were so well known that Keeler retained the name for the new company. Eventually, he was to arrange for the company plant to move to Turkey Crossing, so named after a confrontation between a truckload of turkeys and a steam train. "50 men were employed, mostly carpenters, for the Vega was to be an all-wooden aircraft. The fuselage was of monocoque construction, which combined great strength with clean aerodynamic lines. The same method was to be used much later during World War II, notably on the de Havilland Mosquito. The Vega first flew on the 4th of July, 1927, and became an instant success, and production was then moved to the new Burbank plant in 1928. They had produced the right aircraft at the right time. Some 20 were ordered, and the workforce increased to over 200. Variants followed: the Air Express, the Sirius, and the Orion. Because of their robust construction and speed, they became the chosen planes of many long-distance flyers. Captain Frank Hawks created a New York to Los Angeles record in 19 hours non-stop. Charles and Anne Morrow Lindbergh, flew a Sirius on survey flights for Pan American Airlines. Sir Charles Kingsford Smith broke long-distance records. Wiley Post flew round the world in his Vega in the record time of 8 days, 15 hours. Amelia Earhart made the first solo crossing of the Atlantic by a woman. The legend was growing. It takes a Lockheed to beat a Lockheed. The success of the company made it a prey for takeover, and in April 1929, it was bought out by the Detroit Aircraft Corporation. At first, all was well. Burbank Airport opened with a great flourish, but then came the Wall Street crash. The Detroit company failed, and with it, Lockheed. John Northrop went on to found his own company, and Allan Lockheed remained in Burbank to try to salvage what was left of the business.
Allan became a real estate agent after he had sold the company, and I actually bought a house from him. But the team that came in, headed by Robert Gross, contained Hall Hibbard, who was the vice president of engineering in those days, Cyril Chapelet, who was his finance and administration man, and that team had many others, of course. I shouldn't say many. There were maybe all of 10 or 15. And they involved one man that came with the company, Carl Squire, who was the marketing manager, if you will. We didn't call him that in those days, but he was the salesman. And the team put together quite a lot of different ideas to carry the company from its wooden airplane legend, if you will, and the production, for that matter, into the all-metal world, which they could see coming.
The result was the Electra, an aircraft that was to change the fortunes of Lockheed.
I think this was a pretty courageous move. It was a twin-engine airplane. Lockheed had never built a twin-engine airplane. It was all metal. Lockheed had never built a metal airplane. They had a retractable landing gear. They'd done that once, but this was a little different. And it had two tails on it, which, of course, was the beginning signature, if you will, of one of the designers in the place, Kelly Johnson. And that's when I really first got to know something about Lockheed. Kelly Johnson was Hall Hibbard's sort of chief of advanced design, and he had come from the University of Michigan. And in those days, we had no wind tunnels in the industry, or at least none that I know of. And Kelly used the University of Michigan as a wind tunnel. We had a small tunnel in the basement of the engineering building in Michigan, and I was a student assistant at the time. And so I worked on the Electra and the wind tunnel as a student in Michigan. And that's where the two tails were born. It was a good idea, and still is a good idea for a multi-engine airplane, or a bimotor anyway. In any case, I was interested in it. I met Kelly when he came back to the wind tunnel, and so I came to work for Lockheed after I graduated. Well, that twin-engine Electra was quite a risk for the company. The company had been bought for $40-some-odd thousand, and the development time for this airplane was certainly well over a year or so, which was pretty short. And it was a very successful airplane. It fit a niche in the market and continued to fill a niche in the market, and was actually the foundation of the company.
Howard Hughes flew an Electra around the world in the record time of 3 days and 17 hours. Tragically, Amelia Earhart lost her life over the Pacific when her Electra ran out of fuel while attempting a round-the-world flight. However, the success of the plane prompted the company to build a mock-up of a bomber version in anticipation of a visit by the British Air Ministry. The British were impressed, and ordered 200 aircraft on the spot, and as many more as could be delivered by December 1939. It was the largest single order ever received by the American aircraft industry. Doubts were expressed about the ability of Lockheed's to meet the deadline. By June 1939, 48 aircraft had been completed. Robert Gross and his team then took the industry's first step into major subcontracting. The workforce was increased to 7,000. Production went up to 1 plane a day, then 2. The 250th came off the line 7.5 weeks ahead of schedule. Then the Australians placed an order for 100 Hudsons, and at the same time the British placed a further order for 200. In the end, nearly 3,000 were built, and Lockheed had arrived at the forefront of American aviation.
More bombers for Britain. With the President's plea spurring the aviation industry, the Lockheed plant goes all out in production of Hudson bombers for the RAF. Wings the British Lion wants and is getting special delivery. From across the Atlantic to somewhere in England comes a giant American bomber, one of scores now being ferried over the sea. A Canadian and a Yankee pilot brought this Hudson bomber through stormy ocean skies, and a British air marshal is on hand to greet them. The American flyer's a mighty welcome visitor. This hands across the sea stuff means something.
The Hudson served with distinction in the Royal Air Force Coastal Command, helping to defeat the U-boat during the Battle of the Atlantic, and in the process, establishing Lockheed's reputation for maritime patrol aircraft. Kelly Johnson had been working on a unique design, a twin-engine fighter designated the P-38, which first flew in January 1939. It was a radically new concept, with its twin booms, tricycle undercarriage, and armament concentrated in the nose. After only 5 hours of test flying, the Air Corps attempted to break the transcontinental speed record. But the aircraft, having reached over 400 miles per hour, crash-landed on a golf course.
Had trouble with the P-38. P-38 superchargers didn't match the engine. And in those days, the government furnished all of this equipment. The government furnished the wheels, tires, brakes, instruments, engines, props, superchargers. And we had little control over what we were going to get. We glued them together and hoped they'd work. Well, the P-38 was lucky. Lockheed was lucky. Because as an escort, the P-38 wasn't much of an airplane. At very high altitudes, the supercharger engine mismatch burned up the engine. So more often than not, the B-17s were escorting the P-38s home instead of the other way around. And, but the same mismatch was a super match at sea level. And you could overboost the engine until it couldn't stand it any longer, and it had 50% or more power than it was designed for. And it made a wonderful ground attack fighter. And with the armament it had in it, where it had 4 50 caliber guns and a cannon in the nose, you sort of perforated a hole in the side of the tank and blew the middle out of it. And it was a very effective ground attack fighter, and that's where it was good for the entire war, Pacific and Atlantic.
P-38 had the distinction of being the first American plane to shoot down an enemy aircraft, a Focke-Wulf Condor, which was on patrol off Iceland. Lockheed's were to produce over 3,000 P-38s and nearly 4,000 P-38-1s. They served in all United States combat areas, and Kelly Johnson's design became one of the most innovative and successful of the Second World War. With wartime expansion, Lockheed's had now taken over the whole of the old Empire China Company's site, and work then went ahead to create one of the largest aircraft production units in the world. At this time, there was a fear in the USA of long-range air attack, so the factory was covered and planted with trees and dummy houses to fool the reconnaissance planes of the potential intruders. Besides work on their own aircraft, Lockheed also undertook subcontract work for Boeing, building B-17s. By December 1941, Lockheed had become the biggest aircraft company in the USA. They had already produced over 2,000 aircraft, and the workforce had increased to 53,000. In all, they were to produce over 19,000 airplanes. At one stage, space was so short that they created an open-air production line. It was at this time that Lockheed developed the Hudson into the Ventura for the US Navy, at the same time continuing to produce the P-38s. An increasing number of women were employed on the production lines, and the proximity of Hollywood led to many of the stars helping with fundraising and promotion during these uncertain war days. But by the end of the war, the inevitable decline in the workforce meant it shrank by nearly half. Fortunately, it was to be cushioned by a new aircraft, the C-69. The C-69 had been started before the war as an airliner, became a troop transport for the duration, and then went back to its original role. And between VJ Day and the end of 1945, over 100 were ordered, and the C-69, or Constellation, together with Boeing's Stratocruiser, became the main long-haul airliner of the post-war decade, helping the United States to be the dominant Western aircraft manufacturer. It later went back to the military as an airborne early warning aircraft, and was in fact the first to be fitted with a rotordome. Kelly Johnson and his team had been working on Lockheed's first jet at the highly secret Skunk Works. At the time, they were housed in circus tents next to a plastics factory in Burbank, the smell from which prompted the engineers to name it Skunk, after the foul-smelling factory. The plane that emerged was the P-80, the Shooting Star. Very much a pilot's aeroplane. Test pilot Herman Salmon said of it, "I push my throttle ahead and I go. I pull it back and I don't." It couldn't be much simpler than that. In 1945, it was chosen to equip frontline pursuit groups of the United States Air Force. And in June 1947, it established a new airspeed record of 623.8 miles per hour. Too late to have seen service in the Second World War, the Shooting Star first saw action in the Korean conflict. In the first 7 months alone, over 26,000 sorties were flown in fighter and ground attack roles, and 94 enemy aircraft were destroyed in the air. Long-range versions were also used for reconnaissance work. On the 8th of November 1950, a Shooting Star shot down a MiG-15 in the first ever all-jet air battle. The success of the Shooting Star led the United States Air Force to order a training version, the T-33. It was to train 9 out of 10 Air Force pilots. The United States Navy also ordered a version, which was to become the first carrier-based trainer. Lockheed's continued to develop jet fighters, and the F-104 Starfighter, in which Colonel Howard Johnson established a new altitude record of 91,243 feet, proved yet another milestone. Rival aircraft won back the record, but in late 1959, Captain Joe Jordan set a new world altitude record in the Starfighter of 103,395 feet, nearly 20 miles above the Earth's surface. It fringed on space. The Neptune, which first flew on the 17th of May, 1945, was the first land plane to be designed as a maritime patrol aircraft. It remained in production until 1979, with over 1,100 being built. And for 16 of those years, it held the world's long-distance flight record for a petrol-driven propeller aircraft. In the mid-1950s, the company introduced a new Electra, this time a large turboprop, not unlike the Vickers Vanguard. Both Electra and Vanguard failed to live up to the high hopes of their companies, as they suffered from the introduction of the new short-haul pure jets. What saved the Electra from oblivion was its adaptation into the Orion, a new maritime patrol aircraft designed to replace the Neptune. Over 500 Orions are in service in the USA, Australia, New Zealand, Norway, Iran, Japan, the Netherlands, and Spain. After 30 years, it's still in production. The S-3 Viking was developed from a Navy specification which called for an advanced carrier-based anti-submarine warfare aircraft that would be capable of detecting the new, quieter submarines then entering service with the Russian Navy. With its four-man crew, the Viking is one of the most completely automated aircraft flying, its main computer performing the majority of tactical calculations. It equips 13 squadrons of the US Navy and is the mainstay of the USA's anti-submarine detection system. At the Skunk Works, Kelly Johnson and his team had been working in great secrecy on a project for the CIA, a spy plane. In effect, a powered sailplane, capable of operating at very high altitudes, the U-2. Kelly Johnson was given a free hand. The requirements merely stipulated range, altitude, and provision for equipment.
It was extremely light and fragile. It was probably one of the most fragile airplanes that we had ever built at Lockheed, because it had to fly at great heights, up around 70,000 feet, an unheard of height in those days.
It moved overnight from being the most secret to the most known plane in the world, when on the 1st of May 1960, Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union. Two years later, it was a U-2 that overflew Cuba to set off another crisis between the superpowers.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no?
You will have your answer in due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response on the Soviet Union.
The plane went on to a more placid role, landing on carriers, operating in space research for NASA, and being the first U.S. aircraft to go back into production when it was reborn as the U-3. Kelly Johnson had been working on an even more advanced aircraft, the Mach 3 Blackbird. The technical problems were enormous. Special titanium structures had to be made to withstand the temperatures of over 800 degrees, as the pilots would be operating on the edge of space. The result was a remarkable aircraft.
SR-71 today holds all of the altitude and speed records that there are, almost. But what isn't known, and it's kind of a commentary on how we do things today, is that those records have held now for almost 10 years. And what is not known is that the airplane that got the records was 13 years old when it got the records. So here is the most advanced aircraft that's flying today that we know of, and it's 23 years old. And so why we haven't done something in this country or somewhere else to really put ourselves up another step in technology, I don't know. The technology is there to do anything you would like to do.
It was the climax of a brilliant career in aviation for the boy who had many years before dreamed of building his own aeroplane, the Merlin 1. In July 1951, Lockheed were declared the winner of a competition to supply a new medium-sized tactical military transport that would be capable of working from short and unprepared airstrips. The design team under Willis Hawkins had produced the C-130, later to be known as the Hercules. With its 4 turboprop engines and rugged workmanlike appearance, it was to become a classic. Two prototypes were designed and built at Burbank, and the first flight took place there on the 23rd of August, 1954. Production was then moved to Lockheed's new plant at Marietta in Georgia. It soon entered service with the United States Air Force in a variety of roles. It has gone on to a production run of over 1,700 aircraft in 40 different versions, making it the longest produced transport plane in aviation history. Constructed primarily for the military, its ability to work from short, unprepared landing strips has made it invaluable for relief work. And it's in this humanitarian role that the Herc has come to public attention during the Ethiopian famine, delivering relief supplies to earthquake victims in Morocco, Nicaragua, Peru, and Italy, and to the survivors of typhoons in Chile, Japan, Guam, and the Bay of Bengal. The Hercules has become a symbol of hope rather than of military threat.
become a concern. So the turboprop, while its technology is not as advanced as the jets, is back in vogue again from a fuel-saving standpoint. So the old Herc may be around for a lot of years. And of course, that concept of truck bed height loading and that type of handling system led us on then to some of the other airplanes like the C-141 and the C-5A, which had the same capability.
On the 17th of December, 1963, the 60th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first powered flight at Kitty Hawk, the C-141 was rolled out at Marietta. 248 C-141s, or star lifters, were delivered to the Military Air Transport Service and played a major role in airlifting troops to Southeast Asia. Then, on the 30th of June, 1968, came the first takeoff of the Western world's largest aeroplane, the C-5 Galaxy.
This is the first takeoff of the aircraft. We've applied power to about a 4.46 EPA. The gross weight of the aircraft is 497,000 pounds. The acceleration speed, although it certainly doesn't look like it here from the outside, the elevator comes back at 126 knots. We lift off and away we go. We ease the nose back after we've lifted the airplane off and pick up speed to about 150 knots. And at this point, you see me steepening up the climb to hold a best climb speed of 140 knots for this aircraft based on the data that we have.
In June 1969, the C-5 established a world airlift record by taking off from Edwards Air Force Base with a gross weight of 762,000 pounds. Lockheed are not only renowned for their military aircraft, and the company returned to civilian jet transports with the TriStar, designed to compete with the Douglas DC-10. However, despite its success with the airlines, it was phased out of production in 1982 after 250 were delivered around the world. By now, the company had moved into the space program and was heavily involved with the launch of Columbia in 1982.
Flight liftoff confirmed. get a status, Fido. Go, booster, go.
The present Lockheed Space Division is at Sunnyvale, California, a short distance from the ranch at Alma, where Malcolm and Allan Loughead grew up and dreamed of flight.